Welcome to the store. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me.
The white wolf's curse. The wind whispered through the ancient trees, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. Deep within the forest, the clash of steel and the growls of beasts echoed off the moss-covered stones. Anthony crouched low, his breath steady despite the chaos surrounding him. His keen eyes scanned the shadows, waiting for the next attack. This war had raged for centuries, humans and werewolves locked in a brutal cycle of bloodshed that seemed to have no end. But Anthony had hoped that today, things might change. A flicker of movement caught his attention, and he tightened his grip on the hilt of his sword. His muscles coiled like a spring as a massive, fur-covered shape lunged at him from the underbrush. He rolled to the side, barely avoiding the werewolf's claws. In a swift motion, he was back on his feet, his sword cutting through the air in a precise arc. The werewolf snarled, its eyes blazing with a savage fury. But Anthony wasn't here to kill, he was here for answers. "Hold your ground," he shouted to his men, though he wasn't sure how many were still standing. The ambush had been swift and brutal, the werewolves attacking with a viciousness born from centuries of hatred. But even in the thick of battle, Anthony had felt something different, an unseen force, a pull toward something deeper in the forest. The werewolf in front of him hesitated for a fraction of a second, its gaze flicking toward the distant trees. Anthony seized the moment, driving the hilt of his sword into the beast's snout, sending it reeling. Before it could recover, he leaped into the dense foliage, leaving the fight behind. He could feel it now, the ancient magic that pulsed through the forest, drawing him toward its source. As he ran, the sounds of battle faded behind him, replaced by the eerie silence of the ancient woods. The trees here were older, their gnarled branches stretching toward the sky like skeletal hands. Thick vines covered the ground, and the air was thick with the smell of decay and forgotten secrets. It was here, in the heart of the forest, that the curse had been born. Anthony slowed his pace, his senses on high alert. The ruins of an ancient altar loomed ahead, half buried beneath the undergrowth. He approached cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. This was the place the old stories spoke of, the place where the curse had been cast. But what he hadn't expected was the presence of a werewolf, sitting at the base of the altar. Its fur was white as snow, its eyes gleaming with an intelligence that sent a chill down Anthony's spine. This was no ordinary beast. The white wolf watched him approach, its massive body still, but its gaze intense. For a moment, neither of them moved, and the air between them crackled with tension. "You don't want to fight," Anthony said, his voice steady though his heart raced. He kept his sword at his side, but his hand rested on the hilt, ready for anything. The werewolf let out a low growl, but it wasn't a threat. It was something deeper, something human. Slowly, the creature shifted, its form shrinking, its fur receding until what stood before Anthony was not a wolf but a man. A tall, gaunt man with wild white hair and eyes that still glowed with a faint lupin light. "My name is Lucas," the man said, his voice hoarse, as though he hadn't spoken in years. "And you are here for the same reason I am." Anthony's grip on his sword tightened. "You know about the curse?" Lucas nodded, his expression grim. "I do. I've lived it. And if you're wise, you'll leave this place before it takes you, too." But Anthony didn't move. "I didn't come here to run. I came to end this war." The man who had once been a wolf let out a bitter laugh. "End the war? You think it's that simple? This isn't just a conflict between humans and werewolves. It's a curse, ancient and powerful, and it binds us all. Break it, and the war will end. But that's no easy task." Anthony stepped closer, his eyes scanning the altar. Strange symbols were carved into the stone, glowing faintly in the dim light. "Then tell me how." Lucas hesitated, his gaze lingering on the altar. "The curse was placed here centuries ago by a sorcerer whose name has long been forgotten. He wanted to create a race of warriors to protect the forest. But the magic twisted us, turned us into beasts. Every full moon, we lose ourselves to the curse, and we are driven to hunt, to kill. The war is a symptom, not the cause." Anthony frowned, his mind racing. "If the curse was created, then it can be destroyed." "Perhaps," Lucas said, though there was doubt in his voice. "But the sorcerer's magic is strong. It will take more than just brute force to break it." "Then we'll use more than brute force," Anthony replied. "We'll use wisdom." Lucas looked at him, his eyes narrowing. "You speak as though you've already made up your mind." "I have," Anthony said. "I won't leave this forest until the curse is broken." Lucas let out a slow breath, his shoulders sagging as though a great weight had been lifted from them. "Then we'll need to work together." Anthony extended his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Lucas clasped it. The alliance had been formed, though neither of them knew just how dangerous the path ahead would be. As they made their way deeper into the forest, Lucas led Anthony to places no human had seen in centuries. Sacred groves, hidden valleys, and ancient shrines, long abandoned by the people who had once worshipped there. The forest was old, older than the kingdoms of men, and it held secrets that even Lucas had not uncovered, but there were also dangers. The werewolves that roamed the forest were not like Lucas. They were consumed by the curse, their minds lost to the madness that gripped them during the full moon. Anthony had seen the savagery of these creatures in battle, but now, as they crept through the shadows, he saw them up close. Their eyes glowed with a fierce hunger, and their snarls echoed through the trees like the cries of wild animals. "They won't hesitate to kill us if they catch our scent," Lucas whispered as they crouched behind a fallen tree, watching a pack of werewolves move through the underbrush. "Then we'd better not let them catch our scent," Anthony replied, his hand on his sword. They moved quickly, staying downwind of the pack and keeping to the shadows. Anthony's heart pounded in his chest, but he kept his breathing steady, his focus sharp. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees growing taller, their branches thicker. The air grew colder, and the light that filtered through the canopy took on an eerie, bluish hue. Finally, after what felt like hours, they reached a clearing. In the center of the clearing stood another altar, this one smaller but no less imposing. Strange symbols were etched into its surface, and the air around it shimmered with a faint, otherworldly light. "This is where the curse was born," Lucas said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And this is where it can be undone." Anthony stepped forward, his eyes locked on the altar. He could feel the power radiating from it, ancient and malevolent. This was the source of the curse, the dark magic that had turned men into beasts and fueled the war for centuries. "How do we break it?" Anthony asked. Lucas hesitated, his gaze fixed on the altar. "The ritual requires a sacrifice." Anthony's blood ran cold. "A sacrifice?" Lucas nodded, his face grim. "The sorcerer who cast the curse bound his own life force to it. To break it, someone must give their life in return." For a moment, the weight of those words hung in the air between them. Anthony's mind raced, searching for another way, another solution. But deep down, he knew there was none. The curse was too strong, the magic too ancient. It could only be undone through sacrifice. Anthony's path led him deeper into the forest, where the trees seemed to close in around him, their ancient trunks like sentinels of a bygone era. The sense of being watched grew stronger, a feeling that prickled at the back of his neck. He pushed forward, guided by an unspoken pull toward the heart of the mystery. The forest opened up into a small clearing, and there, half buried under vines and moss, lay the altar. Its surface was etched with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe in the dim light. The altar was a relic of an age long forgotten, its very presence radiating a dark and ancient power. Anthony approached it cautiously, his sword still at the ready. The sense of dread was palpable, but so was the promise of discovery. He knelt beside the altar, brushing away the layers of grime to reveal the intricate carvings beneath. The symbols were unfamiliar, a complex script that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. As he traced the patterns with his fingers, a low growl echoed through the clearing. Anthony spun around, his heart pounding in his chest. Emerging from the shadows was the white-furred werewolf he had seen earlier, the beast's eyes locked onto his with a mix of fear and desperation. Anthony could see the humanity behind the eyes, a hint of the person the werewolf once was. The creature moved closer, its body trembling as if in pain. Anthony stood, raising his sword, but he hesitated. There was something in the werewolf's gaze that told him this was no ordinary foe. "Why are you here?" Anthony demanded, his voice steady despite the tension. "What is this place?" The werewolf's growls were guttural and strained, but as Anthony watched, the beast seemed to struggle with itself. Slowly, the werewolf's form began to shift, the fur receding and the claws retracting until a man, gaunt and ragged, stood before him. The transformation was both horrifying and heartbreaking. The man looked up at Anthony, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and despair. You found it," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "The altar. It's the source of our curse." Anthony lowered his sword slightly, his curiosity piqued. "What happened here? Why are you cursed?" The man took a shaky breath, his gaze darting to the altar. "Long ago, our people lived in harmony with the forest. But we angered the spirits of the ancient ones who watched over this land. They cursed us, turning us into beasts to punish us for our arrogance. We became what we are now, bound by the curse, unable to break free." Anthony's mind raced as he processed the man's words. The curse was not just a physical transformation, it was a punishment from ancient spirits, a spell that had bound the werewolves to their current form. The altar was central to this dark magic. He needed to understand how to break it. "How do we lift the curse?" Anthony asked urgently. "Is there a way?" The man's eyes were filled with a mixture of pain and hope. "There may be a way. The altar holds the key, but it requires an act of great courage and sacrifice. You must perform the ancient ritual to appease the spirits, but it will not be easy." Anthony nodded, determination hardening in his expression. "I'll do whatever it takes. Tell me what needs to be done." The man explained the ritual in halting, fragmented phrases. It involved invoking the spirits, offering a symbol of purity, and reciting an ancient incantation. The altar was the focal point of the ritual, and it had to be performed under the light of the full moon to be effective. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the forest floor. Anthony and the man prepared for the ritual, gathering the necessary items and positioning them around the altar. As night fell, the clearing was bathed in the pale light of the rising moon. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation and the weight of centuries of sorrow. With everything in place, Anthony began the ritual. He chanted the incantation, his voice steady and resonant. The symbols on the altar glowed with an otherworldly light, and a breeze stirred the air as if the spirits themselves were awakening. The white-furred man stood beside him, his expression one of both hope and trepidation. As the ritual reached its climax, a surge of energy erupted from the altar, engulfing them in a blinding light. Anthony felt a powerful force pulling at him, a connection to something far greater than himself. The light intensified, and then, just as suddenly, it faded. When Anthony opened his eyes, the clearing was silent, the altar now devoid of its former dark energy. The man stood beside him, transformed back into a werewolf. But there was something different about him, an aura of peace and relief. The curse had been lifted. The werewolf looked at Anthony with gratitude and a newfound sense of freedom. "You did it," he said, his voice now steady and clear. "You've broken the curse. We're free." Anthony nodded, feeling a deep sense of accomplishment and relief. The forest, too, seemed to breathe easier, the oppressive weight of the curse lifted. The bond between humans and werewolves had been forged anew, not through conflict but through understanding and sacrifice. As dawn approached, Anthony and the werewolves began the journey back to their respective homes. The forest, once a place of fear and hatred, now held the promise of a new beginning. The battle was over, but the real victory lay in the newfound peace between the two worlds. The ancient curse had been broken, and with it, a new chapter was written in the history of both humans and werewolves.